invisible but deadly bursts of radiation from the sun, otherworldly landslides from above, and Marsquakes from below.
Outer space is the last place you want to be as a human being.
What makes fire more deadly in orbit than on Earth? What happens to someone exposed to the harsh extremes of outer space?
The saliva, the blood, goes from a liquid state to a gaseous state.
Buckle up and prepare for space disasters. The year is 2030. A crew of astronauts simply hits the up button in a space elevator. The elevator will bring them to their spacecraft, which will meet them in orbit. They're grateful they don't have to risk the controlled explosion of a rocket launch.
We can now create carbon nanotube fibers that are stronger than steel. And believe it or not, they are strong enough to keep a space elevator afloat in space, so that you can literally climb your way into the heavens.
The 60,000-mile cable is attached to the docking station that revolves at the same rate as the Earth. Just like a geosynchronous satellite, it stays over a fixed spot on the ground. A space elevator would be any astronaut's dream. But the space elevator dream can also turn into a nightmare.
The space elevator has to be anchored to the Earth. But what happens if you have storms and all of a sudden the moorings begin to snap?
With the cable still attached up in space, it will start swinging wildly, striking objects hundreds of miles away in any direction. It's also possible that some type of guidance computer or thruster problem could knock the platform in space off course, snapping the cable at the top. If it happened while a crew is going up or down the cable, they would be in for the last ride of their lives. And the 60,000 miles of cable hurtling toward Earth is long enough to wrap itself around the planet almost 3 times at the equator, creating havoc over a wide area.
It would be not only disastrous and dangerous for the people involved, the kinetic energy of something like that whipping through the atmosphere would be a menace to navigation. So it's going to have an inherent danger in it that any human system has.
This is just one of many potential disasters facing future space explorers. Living in space will also involve grave dangers. Colonies on the Moon or Mars will be faced with threats from all directions, especially above, where sudden spikes of radiation can turn deadly.
If we were walking around on the surface of the Moon, I would say our #1 concern should be solar flare. The sun erupts. The protons coming from that flare could kill an astronaut. There have been several flares over the last couple decades, which if we had had astronauts on the Moon just walking around in a spacesuit would have been lethal for them.
On Earth, we're protected from most radiation. Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field are like a protective fence, letting only a fraction of particles through. On the Moon and Mars, you are directly in the firing line. The Moon has no atmosphere or magnetic field. Mars has very little atmosphere and only weak localized magnetic fields. NASA takes the solar flare threat seriously because it has already come close to killing Apollo astronauts.
The Apollo lunar landing crews were quite fortunate. In 1972, in August, there was a major solar flare. There was what they call the Great Solar Storm that happened to just take place in between the Apollo 16 mission in April and the Apollo 17 mission in December of that year. Had that occurred while there was a crew on the surface of the moon, they would have been dead.
The effects would be similar to certain people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those who were not killed in the initial blast, but were overwhelmed by the extreme radiation dosage within several seconds. An astronaut caught in that situation will have little time to react. A flood of deadly particles penetrates the body, killing all of the astronaut's cells in a few brief moments. So it's no surprise that space colonists will need to be constantly on alert.
We're going to need weather reports, but they're going to be space weather reports. We're going to need satellites monitoring the sun, giving us advance warning of flares. The light from the sun takes only 8 minutes to reach the moon. Coming behind it would be the particles, the lethal radiation. You'd have minutes, half an hour, that sort of time frame before you wanted to really be in a shelter. Such a storm might last for a couple days.
One option for protection is living underground. But don't let the barren terrain fool you. The Moon and Mars are still active bodies where natural disasters like those seen on Earth can strike.
I'm here in the Mojave Desert in a cave created by a lava flow, underneath 5 or 6 feet of rocks. Well, being underground in a cave may be an option for habitation on the Moon or on Mars. On the surface of the Moon or Mars, there's radiation from the sun, there's cosmic radiation. On Mars, there's dust storms. If we're underground, well, we're safe from those hazards, but we have other hazards. Imagine being in this cave when there's quakes, rocks falling down, crushing us, pinning us.
A Moon or Mars quake could also threaten an above-ground colony. The Moon and Mars don't have tectonic plates like the ones that cause most of Earth's quakes and volcanic eruptions, and there are no signs of active volcanoes. But the Moon and Mars do have hot cores. So as the pressure from that heat heads to the surface, the shaking starts. And where there's quakes, there's often another disaster.
Just recently, we've seen a landslide occurring on Mars. It was captured with the cameras in orbit. So we know this does happen. And that can be hard to predict. We might put our base someplace which appears perfectly safe, and then a few years later realize that there's a landslide hazard.
Scientists are still unsure what started the 2008 landslide near the North Pole of Mars. It was in an icy area, and researchers believe most of the slide material was ice. That's just the type of place a colony might be located to take advantage of converting the ice to drinkable water. Even a distant quake could still trigger a slide near a colony. But what if a hidden fault line is running right under the buildings? In the future, space colonists living on the Moon or Mars will have plenty of threats to deal with, including natural disasters like moonquakes and Marsquakes.
They're not active the way we're used to on Earth. They're active in different ways, and there may be unexpected ways that they could cause problems for us.
since our current knowledge of these other worlds has literally only scratched the surface, it's possible that in the future we could locate a base right over a fault line without realizing what's below. And since weight is always an issue when carrying things into space, the lightweight buildings could be quite vulnerable, especially the outer layer.
If anything happens to that protective layer, that's trouble, very rapid trouble. As the gases stream out of the habitat, you've got to have a very efficient and quick procedure for getting into a spacesuit to survive that sort of decompression.
Death would not be instantaneous if oxygen and atmospheric pressure inside the colony are suddenly lost. On Mars, there is a thin atmosphere, although it's not breathable, since it's mostly carbon dioxide. On the Moon, there is only the vacuum of space. But you'd still have a chance, as we've learned from industrial accidents in vacuum chambers on Earth.
Exposure for maybe a minute or so is survivable. Now, if you stay in a vacuum long enough, there's not enough oxygen, so nitrogen that's saturated in your blood and your tissues comes out of solution and causes bubbles. That's decompression sickness. And also, if you hold your breath, you can get what they call pulmonary overinflation, and your lung ruptures into your bloodstream, and that's called an embolism. So there's multiple factors that can result in death from exposure to the vacuum of space.
Then there's the temperature extremes. Temperatures on the Moon go from a high of about 240 degrees Fahrenheit down to around 290 below. Mars can get just as cold. Although you could get lucky and have a nice 70-degree summer day. But without a breathable atmosphere, going outside without a spacesuit is still a very bad idea. Another thing above-ground space colonists will have to be on the lookout for is meteors. The craters on the Moon tell the story. It's an easy target.
We're relatively comfortable down here underneath these layers of protection. We've got a thick atmosphere which absorbs and burns up meteorites. We go to the Moon, nothing. There's no thick atmosphere. We are exposed to everything that space is throwing at us. We go to Mars, there's a thin atmosphere, but it's not anywhere near as good as the Earth's. Again, we're exposed to what's coming in from space.
Smaller meteors that are only inches or fractions of an inch wide, known as micrometeoroids, will strike most often and without warning.
You're walking along the surface of Mars, and something the size of a grain of sand comes slamming into your spacesuit. That's going to be a serious problem. It's going to be a loss of the pressure in the spacesuit. It could mean loss of life of an astronaut. When we have lots of people doing a lot of work on other worlds, eventually that's going to happen. That's the equivalent of a lightning strike, a rare, possibly fatal event.
Micrometeoroids could also punch a hole through the wall of a colony building. Like space stations, colonies will probably be built in a series of sections or modules. And just as crews have had to seal off sections of a space station in an emergency, colonists will likely do the same. Large meteors will hopefully be tracked, so the colonists will know they're coming. But evacuation might not do any good. A nearby strike would still send out a deadly shockwave for miles. a 10-foot wide meteor hits with the explosive equivalent of 6,000 to 8,000 tons of TNT. Flying debris could also damage colony buildings beyond repair. And anything approaching a direct hit, there'll be little evidence that the colonists were ever there. It's unlikely that colonists would live anywhere near one of Mars's volcanoes. And the moon probably hasn't seen volcanic activity in the last few billion years. But even ancient remnants of volcanoes could still cause trouble for crews in vehicles.
Both the moon and Mars show evidence of volcanic flows. So we might expect to find there this sort of thing, volcanic caves. Now imagine driving along the surface, come across one of these, you're not expecting it. That could ruin your day, it could ruin your vehicle. You could be at the bottom of this pit without any way to get up. Even worse would be imagining one of these volcanic caves with a thin layer of volcanic rock on top of it. You move across on top of that, it gives, and down you go.
But not all colony disasters will be so dramatic. Simply running out of supplies is one of the greatest dangers. Since the moon is much closer, emergency supplies could arrive in a matter of days. With Mars, help is many months to years away, depending on how the planets are aligned.
On Mars, if something goes wrong and you lose some supplies, resupply from Earth can be 2 or 3 years away. You think you've got enough to last, you lose half of it through an accident, you're dead. It's a real problem. I think that means you're going to have more than what you need. You're going to have enough for 5, 6 years.
Living in space much closer to home, on space stations and longer shuttle flights, has already taught us a lot about the dangers of space. And fire is space crew enemy number 1.
The reason fire is such a threat is because spacecraft traditionally have higher levels of oxygen than the atmosphere, certainly in higher concentrations under pressure. They're also filled with electronic equipment. Electronic equipment puts out heat, and often there are sparks and arcs. It's a bad combination.
Luckily, designers have made it easier for crews to put out fires where all of those miles of wire lurk behind the control panels.
This is a mock-up of the Space Shuttle flight deck that we use for training of crews. If you look at the various panels we have, you will see small holes like this at various locations around it. And these are for fire extinguishers, so that if there is a fire behind one of these panels, you can put an extinguisher in there to extinguish the fire.
Andrew Thomas knows a thing or two about fires in space. While on the Mir space station in 1998, a fire suddenly broke out.
All the smoke was pumped right out into the cabin.
Crews hurtle through space in their enclosed craft, desperate to maintain the Earth-like atmosphere inside. Out here, fire is one of the biggest threats. In 1998, NASA astronaut Andrew Thomas is on board the Mir space station with 2 Russian cosmonauts. Suddenly, a fire breaks out. Ironically, the fire starts while cleaning what's known as an air scrubber, one of the filters designed to remove exhaled carbon dioxide and other toxins from the space crew's environment.
All the smoke was pumped right out into the cabin, and so all of a sudden, the cabin in one part of the space station just became thick with a pall of smoke. And of course, all the air handlers then moved all that smoke around the spacecraft, so within about 2 hours, the entire spacecraft was completely filled with smoke. So we had to just wait for the air handlers to scrub all of this contamination out. And that took about 2 days. And we all manifested symptoms of the toxicity of that environment. When there's a lot of carbon monoxide at those levels, you have nausea, a certain amount of confusion, invariably a headache because you're oxygen deprived. It's just a very uncomfortable feeling.
The dangers of fire in space go beyond the fact that you can't open a window or call the fire department. Fire actually behaves differently inside a spacecraft in zero gravity.
What we are seeing is a candle flame. The bottom one is a candle in normal gravity. And as you can see, the flame moves up because buoyancy pushes the hot gases around the flame up. The top photograph is the same candle, but in the absence of gravity.
Columbia Space Park for the module. A mist burn will be initiated here in about 15 seconds.
The hot gases don't move up, and what you have is an spherical flame.
There's the flame. So here's the initial light off for combustion module 2.
So putting a smoke detector on the ceiling, like we do on Earth, doesn't work in space. Instead, detectors are located next to small suction devices that draw air and any smoke or other toxins toward the detector. To figure out just how dangerous fire is in space, Professor Fernandez-Peyo's team performs experiments in the University of California, Berkeley Combustion Lab and on KC-135 aircraft in short bursts of zero G. In theory, fires in zero gravity should be less intense because the hot gases don't rise, which means cool air isn't drawn in at the base to keep feeding the flames. But they're finding that the reality inside a spacecraft is more dangerous. Air conditioning systems create small air currents. Those currents bring fresh air, or in this case, fuel, to the fire. At the same time, the low airflow and lack of gravity don't remove the heat as quickly as on Earth. The result?
This type of fires are hotter and more dangerous than in normal gravity.
And fire is likely to become even more of a safety hazard inside the new Ares Orion spacecraft being designed to replace the shuttle.
What they've decided to do was to reduce the pressure and increase the oxygen. And by doing this, they reduce the preparation time that it takes for the astronauts to go from the vehicle to outside of the vehicle. So what we're doing is we're testing materials at that proposed environment. We've learned that for the environment that they've chosen for the next generation of vehicles, things actually ignite about 20% faster than they would in the current environment.
The combination of high oxygen content and low airflow means just about anything can catch fire, even metal. In a worst-case future scenario, a space station crew is unable to quickly extinguish a fire. It grows too fast to seal off in a separate module. Even if they put on emergency oxygen masks, the heat of the flames will likely kill them. And if they're somehow able to survive the flames, the filtering system is completely overloaded. They are left to die in a toxic stew from smoke inhalation. The best chance of survival with an out-of-control fire is to abandon ship and return in a re-entry capsule if one is available. That was the key to the survival of the crew of Apollo 13. April 11th, 1970, the three-man crew launches into space. 2 days later, on their way to the moon, an oxygen tank suddenly explodes. The explosion causes a substantial loss of oxygen and damages the service module's electrical system. The crew is forced to live in the cramped lunar capsule.
Apollo 13 is the classic case of the failure that doesn't kill you. It happened at the right time. It happened when they were on their way to the moon, so they could use the lunar module as a lifeboat and get back to Earth. Had the same problem occurred after the lunar landing, when Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes were on their way back to Earth, there would have been nothing they could do. They would have been dead.
The threat of fire is especially high inside spacesuits. During spacewalks, also known as EVAs or extravehicular activity, the spacesuits need to be kept at low pressures. Working in a fraction of Earth's atmosphere is the key to flexibility.
If you had a spacesuit that was at 1 atmosphere, you would be like basically in a balloon, and you couldn't move.
With low pressure, just like a climber in the thin atmosphere of Mount Everest, astronauts need to breathe highly flammable 100% oxygen.
This is an arm from the spacesuit. It was burned up in a fire in 1980 at Johnson Space Center. Just doing some checkout tests, pressurizing the system with the 2 different oxygen sources. And when this fire occurred, it was, quite a shock. People were standing nearby it, and someone was supposed to be in the suit the next day for a manned test, and it could have been a fatal fire. Even as it is, this suit is worth, at the time, $3.1 million. And it also took NASA $20 million to recover from this fire in terms of redesigning the suit.
Extravehicular activity is dangerous for many other reasons as well. In fact, the world's first spacewalk almost ended in disaster.
Alexei Leonov did the first spacewalk that any human did in 1965. But in the rush to accomplish that space spectacular and thereby beat the Americans, the Soviets took some shortcuts on the safety of the cosmonaut. And so he blew up like the Michelin Man.
The suit became rigid. It couldn't handle the pressure differences between the breathable atmosphere inside and the vacuum of space.
The problem is you've got a spacecraft in the Soyuz capsule that he was flying that's very small, and the hatch for it is even smaller. Ultimately, his response was to let a little bit of the air out and just deflate the thing enough so that he could crawl back in through the hatch. But he will tell you that to this day, that he wasn't sure he'd be able to make it.
An astronaut having, like Leonov, to let the pressure out in order to be able to maneuver in it is in the same situation as a diver ascending from deep water too quickly. Nitrogen bubbles will form in your bloodstream and not only be painful, they'll kill you.
And during EVAs, a simple thing such as an unsecured tether or a misfiring emergency thruster can also spell disaster. Being outside of a spacecraft on a spacewalk is the most dangerous thing an astronaut in orbit can do. One false move can be deadly, especially if that false move takes you away from the spacecraft.
There was an instance on one of the Russian space stations, the Soyuz, where one of the crew members was not tethered, and he was in the airlock area watching the other crew member, and he slowly started to drift out, and the other cosmonauts saw him and grabbed him. An untethered person in space without appropriate propulsion system to get back would be very, very serious. I mean, basically, you're lost at sea.
Even with a propulsion system, it can fail or run out of its limited propellant supply before the astronaut reaches safety. The astronaut will simply keep floating off into space. The International Space Station is unable to chase someone down, and if the shuttle were docked, it would take too long to undock and mount a rescue. In this nightmare scenario, the astronaut will likely have several hours of oxygen remaining to contemplate the end. As long as the suit is intact, pressure will not be an issue. Either the oxygen will run out, or the system, which removes exhaled carbon dioxide, will stop working. Either way, the astronaut will suffocate and continue floating into the emptiness of space. The same micrometeoroids that can devastate space colonies also pose a lethal threat to spacewalks and entire spacecraft. Plus, in low Earth orbit, these rocky little gremlins have company, space junk. And all of these things are racing around at over 22,000 miles an hour. At these speeds, objects that are only a fraction of an inch wide can be deadly.
A micrometeoroid flying through space is a lot like a golf ball flying through the air, with these differences. The micrometeoroid is much, much smaller. And because it travels at hypervelocity, it's far more destructive when it hits. If a micrometeoroid hits your spacesuit, it's going to put a hole in it. You don't have reach or the ability to patch or fix it, unless you've got a fellow astronaut right there. You're going to die. Your air is going to leak out fairly quickly. It's going to gush out. Your blood's going to boil. That's going to be it.
And what causes blood to boil? Well, in space, boiling blood has nothing to do with heat. It's all about the sudden lack of atmospheric pressure.
The idea that blood boils is really a misnomer. The liquid in your body goes from a liquid state to a gaseous state.
There have been many tales about what happens to an unprotected person in outer space. Here's the real story. As the vacuum of space fills the spacewalker's leaking suit, the liquid parts of the tongue and eyes begin to bubble, along with all of the saliva, internal fluids, and blood. As the blood turns to gas, oxygen no longer travels to the brain or anywhere else. The brain shuts down within about 15 seconds, leaving the victim unconscious. Soon after, the rest of the cells in the body die. Temperature extremes could also play a role, since the sunlit areas of space reach 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and the shaded areas quickly plummet to 250 degrees below zero. And just how big a hole is too big for a spacesuit?
You're really asking a very small amount of material to stop a particle that could be coming in at 7 kilometers per second. You can see the entry hole from the test, and it has many, many layers, ending with what's called the bladder. And this is a pressure retaining layer. That's about a 2 to 3 millimeter hole, a 4 millimeter for an EVA suit on the soft goods. This material would be considered catastrophic.
Luckily, no one in space has ever suffered this fate. Impacts can also cause trouble in sneakier ways. So NASA goes to great lengths to simulate different types of micrometeoroid damage down on Earth. Researchers inside the hypervelocity building of the White Sands Test Facility in New Mexico create impacts using compressed hydrogen gas guns. These guns definitely bring the heat, shooting objects up to 19,000 miles per hour at shuttle and space station parts to assess the damage.
At that velocity, you can get from Los Angeles to New York in about 8 minutes. The testing that we're going to perform today is on an International Space Station handle that the astronauts use on the outside of the space station in order to transverse around the space station safely. Several astronauts have cut their gloves severely. This is a great concern to NASA because when they design the space station, they are very careful to eliminate all sharp edges because you don't want something snagging the astronaut spacesuits and creating a hole and ending a mission.
Technicians mount the handle in the target chamber, place the tiny 1/32 of an inch wide projectile within a holder that will disintegrate once fired, then add gunpowder to the breech.
We take gunpowder and propel a piston which compresses hydrogen gas up to about 100,000 psi. It's that highly compressed gas that accelerates the projectiles from 0 to 19,000 miles per hour. We use 3 different types of cameras. One takes a snapshot, another one takes a film, and the third type is a digital camera which takes 16 frames at 200 million frames per second.
The technicians retreat behind a blast shield and prepare to fire. the chamber is cleared of oxygen and other gases to simulate the vacuum of outer space. Now, the moment of truth. How much damage did this simulated micrometeoroid cause?
Even though it is a small impact, there's enough of a lip with enough structure so that an astronaut could catch their glove on such a lip and cause a tear in their glove.
And if a projectile only 1/32 of an inch wide can cause this type of damage, you won't believe what a larger object can do. At the NASA White Sands Test Facility in New Mexico, researchers load small projectiles into huge guns. The projectiles simulate micrometeoroids and space junk. They slam into spacecraft parts at up to 19,000 miles an hour, creating disasters on Earth to better understand disasters in space. At such incredibly high speeds, a very small object can cause very big trouble.
I'm standing inside of our largest target chamber of our 1-inch gun. The gun is 175 feet long and can launch up to a 3/4 inch size projectile. I'm holding a target that was impacted with a 5/8 inch projectile, and as you can see, this is the entry hole, and it went all the way through the test article. An impact of this size would be a catastrophic event in space.
The only hope the International Space Station crew would have for survival is to put on emergency breathing masks and head to the re-entry capsule. An object less than an inch wide would have forced them to abandon this multi-billion-dollar facility. That type of scenario is the reason why crews are constantly adding extra layers of protection to the outside of the space station. For another type of space collision, we have only ourselves to blame. In 1997, a Russian cosmonaut had trouble guiding an unmanned cargo craft to its docking point with the Mir space station.
Now, we know in aviation that 70% of the accidents are human-related, so it wouldn't surprise you to think that humans have also a big role in accidents and mishaps in space. The Mir collision actually was because a crew member complained that he wasn't trained enough to do the rendezvous, and the ground control team said, well, you have to do it anyway. The hit occurred and it caused a leak in the cabin pressure, so now they started to lose cabin pressure. And then the space station started to tumble because it was like pool balls. One hits another, it causes it to move. So even a minor thing, just the control of a rendezvous and docking could have almost catastrophic consequence.
But the disasters that have happened in space still pale in comparison to the disasters of getting into space and returning. There is a saying that the first 50 miles and the last 50 miles are the most dangerous part of any mission. The 1986 Challenger launch disaster and the 2003 Columbia re-entry tragedy make that clear. But if we're ever going to travel beyond our solar system, we're going to need to move beyond our current rocket technology. One possibility that both thrills and terrifies is known as an antimatter engine. Inside massive particle accelerators, scientists have created minute amounts of antimatter, which is made of atoms that have the opposite charges of normal atoms. So with antimatter, the electrons are positive and the protons are negative. When matter and antimatter come into contact, they annihilate each other, releasing tremendous amounts of energy.
Antimatter engines have a 100% conversion rate of matter into energy. Realize that even an atomic bomb is only 1% efficient. Only 1% of the mass of an atomic bomb is converted to energy. In an antimatter engine, we're talking about nearly 100% of the mass converted into energy. It is, for the next century, the propulsion system of choice. But there's a problem.
A teaspoon of antimatter might be able to propel us across the solar system. But that same teaspoon also has the power to destroy an entire city. And once a spacecraft is out in deep space, simple accidents can suddenly tip the balance from life to death. As we venture to Mars and beyond, with journeys lasting years at a time, the chances of becoming stranded in space will become much greater.
For example, on a flight to Mars, what if a micrometeoroid punches an oxygen tank? What if you just are simply running out of breathable air? There is nothing you can do. You can die graciously is what you can do, however long it takes.
Another source of disasters, especially with journeys measured in years, is something that many people overlook.
One thing we forget is our fellow man, our fellow astronauts. If you're cooped up in this tiny little space capsule for, let's say, a year at a time going to Mars, or years going into deep space, you can go crazy. You can get claustrophobic. The guy next door could really get on your nerves, and you want to strangle him after a certain point.
Although the incidents aren't highly publicized, crew members have had problems getting along in the past with dangerous results.
There was at least one Soviet space station crew of the 1970s that didn't get along pretty famously and actually supposedly had a fist fight. These stresses are going to manifest themselves on these long-duration missions. Anybody who thinks they aren't is fooling himself.
And to make things even more interesting, Russian cosmonauts supposedly have firearms stowed on board as a precaution after an extremely off-course landing in 1965.
The crew landed up in the woods in Siberia and were there for about 3 days. And they had to fight off wolves until they were rescued. After that particular mission, the Soviets decided that they were going to put a sawed-off shotgun in every Soyuz capsule in case something like that happened again.
The cosmonauts are now rumored to have handguns stored in emergency kits. But no one is eager to offer any official details of guns in space. And the risk of having a weapon aboard isn't just a concern if tempers flare.
There is actually a documented case of a payload specialist who flew on a shuttle flight, whose experiment failed, and he spent his whole life getting this experiment ready. It failed, and he actually talked about killing himself. And the crew themselves actually tried to protect him and guarded the hatch so he wouldn't kill them.
Even with all of the space travel lessons learned so far, one thing is clear. Nothing can completely prevent disasters from striking in the future.
If we're going to continue human spaceflight, we have to accept the risk because it is a very dangerous occupation. But we have to manage the risk, and that's going to require good technical people and good leadership.
But just as surely as disasters will strike, there is another certainty when it comes to manned space exploration.
I think we have a gene for exploration, a gene for discovery. Not only is it good for our evolution, because we find new avenues to reproduce and to colonize, but I think it's also inside the spirit of human beings to want to know what's out there. Is it possible to reach areas that we've never been before? And the thrill of being the first person to explore new terrain, that's fantastic.
In the beginning, there was darkness, and then, bang, giving birth to an endless expanding existence of time, space, and matter. Now see further than we've ever imagined, beyond the limits of our existence, in a place we call the universe.
In space, threats can come from any direction. Meteors from deep space. Invisible but deadly bursts of radiation from the sun. Otherworldly landslides from above. And Marsquakes from below.
outer space is the last place you want to be as a human being.
What makes fire more deadly in orbit than on Earth? What happens to someone exposed to the harsh extremes of outer space?
The saliva, the blood, it goes from a liquid state to a gaseous state.
Buckle up and prepare for space disasters. The year is 2030. A crew of astronauts simply hits the up button in a space elevator. The elevator will bring them to their spacecraft, which will meet them in orbit. They're grateful they don't have to risk the controlled explosion of a rocket launch.
We can now create carbon nanotube fibers that are stronger than steel. And believe it or not, they are strong enough to keep a space elevator afloat in space, so that you can literally climb your way into the heavens.
The 60,000-mile cable is attached to the docking station that revolves at the
A short flight from Las Vegas, deep in the Nevada desert, lies Area 51, the CIA's secret. A giant clandestine base that remained unacknowledged and disavowed by the US government for almost 60 years. But in August of 2013, the CIA finally admits this place is real. And today, Richard Coe, a former US Air Force pilot, is heading straight toward it.
They just picked us up back on radar. They lost us for a little while because of the terrain.
Coe is providing a legal tour of the perimeter of Area 51, some of the most heavily restricted airspace on Earth. And he's being tracked by the Air Force.
They obviously want to keep an eye on us because anytime civilians are operating so close to restricted airspace, they prefer to obviously know where we are and what our intentions are.
Located at Groom Lake, Area 51 is surrounded by restricted airspace, covering 440 square miles.
As we get closer and closer, I anticipate they're going to get more and more curious of what we're doing over there.
He's 12 miles out, and at 10,000 feet, America's heavily guarded secret base comes into view.
62 Juliet, destination. You familiar with restricted airspace?
Entering any controlled airspace in the U.S. post 9/11 is high risk. But out here, security is tighter than almost anywhere else in the country. The box that surrounds America's top secret base is designated 4808 North. And the tower now issues an explicit order for the pilot to change course.
Skyline 6 Kilo Juliet, turn north immediately, sir, for restricted airspace.
But it's not just the airspace around Area 51 that's heavily guarded. Aerospace historian Peter Merlin has been researching Area 51 for the last 30 years.
Not just anyone can get into Area 51. It's surrounded by harsh desert, but also restricted military land. There is no fence. There are just orange posts marking the border, and they're hard to see.
Area 51 is obscured from the road by mountains and is protected by a security cordon radiating at least 10 miles from the hidden base. Even on public land, activity here is monitored by the military.
Any vehicles driving down the Groom Lake Road are detected by magnetic sensors. Each one sends an electronic signal to the guardhouse, alerting them so that they know where you're coming from and how fast you're making progress down the road.
13 miles past this point is one of these security outposts.
So this is the boundary of Area 51. We've got security guards watching us from the hilltop. Warning signs telling us not to go any further. There are orange posts that mark the boundary itself. No fences, no gates, and cameras watching us from the hilltops. We don't want to cross this line. If we do, we'll be arrested.
But according to one former Area 51 security guard, trespassers in the past faced a worse outcome.
If they demonstrate they were going to try to penetrate, you know, they gave me the all clear to waste them.
But what's going on here in the Nevada desert? Why is the U.S. government trying so hard to keep people out? Finally, the truth has emerged in declassified documents just published in August 2013. According to a report released by the CIA, Area 51 was created in 1955 for a single purpose: to test a top-secret aircraft project codenamed Aquatone. Aquatone is the Cold War code name for the U-2, an aircraft built to spy over the Soviet Union at a time when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev publicly boasts about his country's nuclear capability.
They were bragging about their missiles, they were bragging about their bombers, they were bragging about this and that. That got our government's attention.
In the 1950s, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft are vulnerable to Soviet fighters and surface-to-air missiles. Flying spy missions behind enemy lines in conventional aircraft is too risky. So the covert Aquatone project is designed to fly outside the range of Soviet air defenses. Capable of flying at 70,000 feet, 13 miles above the Earth, the U-2 has a range of 3,000 miles, more than enough to operate behind enemy lines.
I did not know the name of the aircraft, what it looked like, but I knew one thing about it: it's a high flyer.
Tony Bavacqua joins the secret venture in 1957 as a pilot.
Well, in this locker is a lifesaver that we wore in the U-2, called the partial pressure suit. Partial pressure suit kept you alive. If you lost pressurization, these outside hoses blow up and squeeze these even tighter, and that's what prevents the blood from boiling.
In addition to life support systems, the CIA's spy plane carries 700 pounds of the latest photo imaging equipment. With this technology, the U.S. can, in theory, get its eyes inside the Soviet Union undetected. But to test the new reconnaissance jet, the CIA, working with the U.S. Air Force, needs a remote location.
Groom Lake was selected because it was in a very sparsely populated area of Nevada. It looks very much like what you see behind us. It's a flat, featureless plain of hard-packed clay. It can support the weight of any aircraft, so it's a perfect natural landing field.
In 1955, construction of America's secret base begins.
The airfield that emerged from the primordial lake bed began with a 5,000-foot-long runway. Then they needed hangars, so 3 hangars were built, along with a few warehouses, administration buildings, a chow hall, and rudimentary accommodations for the workers, consisting of essentially a trailer park.
Named after a simple grid reference on an Atomic Energy Commission map, the newly created Area 51 is seen here in a 3D rendering of the earliest known high-altitude photograph that shows the layout of the CIA's top-secret base. The place where Tony Bavacqua arrives to work on the U-2.
When I got off there at Groom Lake, I see a runway, a little tower, a couple hangars, a community center type building. We slept in trailers, and there were 2 or 3 of us in each one. No TV, no radio. It was pretty sparse.
Given the secrecy of the CIA project, all of the people selected to work at Area 51 are subject to intense scrutiny.
Security there was absolutely very tight, very tight. Being informed on what you can talk about or not talk about starts right at the very beginning. It's just that way. You don't talk about anything that's classified.
To ensure secrecy and to protect the real purpose of the U-2 spy plane, the CIA creates a cover story. It announces that the high-flying U-2 is going to be flown out of a place called Watertown Strip, Nevada, on weather observation missions. But in the late 1950s, CIA documents confirm that U-2 operations at Area 51 are disrupted by another top-secret government program. On the edge of the Nevada testing range, the home of America's nuclear program, Area 51 lies downwind of radioactive fallout.
One of the things that started bothering me about working up there is that it's directly northeast of weapons test. The prevailing winds in Las Vegas are from the southwest, and when they were doing above ground testing, all this radioactive dust would fly into the air, and of course there was plenty to worry about due to fallout.
For more than 2 years, as America tests nuclear warheads, just 30 miles to the southwest, the CIA's secret airstrip in Nevada remains largely unoccupied, too dangerous due to nuclear fallout. But despite the interruptions at the base, the CIA starts a new project, one that will define the future of Area 51. Today, America's stealth aircraft have a reputation for near invisibility to enemy radar. But back in the late 50s, the only way to achieve stealth is flying at extreme altitude. King of these birds is the CIA's U-2. But on May 1st, 1960, America's top-secret spying mission over the Soviet Union is blown when a USSR surface-to-air missile downs a high-flying U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers. We now know that the CIA predicted this might happen.
The CIA knew that Soviet surface-to-air missile technology was going to catch up to the point where it could shoot down a high flyer like the U-2. It was no longer enough to have an airplane that could just fly several times the height of a normal airplane.
A CIA stealth program, codenamed Project Rainbow, is green-lit to camouflage the U-2.
In an effort to make the U-2 less vulnerable to Soviet radar, the test team at Area 51 applied a layer of radar-absorbent material to the fuselage of the U-2 prototype. It consisted of a conductive grid pattern on a flexible sheet, which was attached to a layer of honeycomb glued to the surface of the aircraft's skin. The grid pattern earned the material the nickname wallpaper.
But adding wallpaper adds weight to the aircraft and reduces its ability to fly high, making it more vulnerable to Soviet defenses.
Because the wallpaper was not a huge success, the CIA began looking into the idea of a successor to the U-2, an airplane that would be able to fly higher and faster and be less visible to radar.
Unlike the U-2, the CIA's next aircraft project, codenamed Oxcart, has stealthy capabilities engineered into it from day one.
They told us that this program was so classified that the documents weren't even marked, because if somebody accidentally had a folder that blew out of their hands and the papers went blowing down the street, that if it said secret on it, everybody would want to know what it was. But if it didn't have any markings whatsoever, the people would just sweep it up and throw it into a trash can and not worry about the fact that it was classified.
Details of this CIA operation were top secret for decades. But now, with the recent release of CIA documents, it's okay for men who worked on the so-called Oxcart program to reveal some of their experiences at Area 51. One of them is Thornton T.D. Barnes.
It took me 3 months to be cleared for the project. At that particular time, Oxcart was the most important thing the United States was doing. We were developing a stealth plane, something no one else had been able to do. They told us, we do not want you to record it, do not talk about it, it doesn't exist.
Secrecy is all important because Project Oxcart's new jet, called the A-12, is equipped with state-of-the-art materials to reduce its visibility to radar.
A-12 was the best aircraft ever built, and it was so far ahead of anything else that people had on the boards.
Designed to fly at 90,000 feet and at speeds faster than a speeding bullet, the CIA's A-12 spy plane is built to withstand temperatures hundreds of degrees greater than the U-2. Peter Law, a thermodynamic engineer at Lockheed, worked on the high-flying aircraft at the company's legendary Skunk Works factory in Burbank, California.
When you're flying the speed of the U-2, everything's too cold. Now, when you fly the speed of the A-12, now it's too hot.
The only metal light enough and strong enough to withstand the high temperatures Lockheed's A-12 is exposed to is titanium, in short supply in the United States. Ironically, back then, the Soviet Union is the only reliable place to source the titanium they need. So the CIA creates a series of dummy companies to buy the material directly from its Cold War enemy.
Russia supplied the titanium that made the A-12s. Of course, they didn't know that. That was another amazing thing for us as engineers. Wow, we're making something out of their material to go take pictures over their country. And they probably wouldn't have been too eager to sell us that titanium if they knew where it was going.
Lockheed engineers designed the A-12 to be difficult to spot on radar. But to test it out, they need to evaluate its radar cross-section.
Radar cross-section is the key to stealth. An airplane presents a certain signature to the radar depending on how reflective it is. You can have a small aircraft that's extremely reflective and looks large on radar, or a large aircraft that's not particularly reflective that looks relatively small on radar. The key to stealth is making the radar signature as small as possible.
At Area 51, the radar signature of an aircraft is evaluated on a pylon, affectionately called the pole. A covert facility situated at the northeast end of the Area 51 complex. On the top of this 60-foot structure, a full-scale model of the A-12 is subjected to 18 months of testing.
We had all these radar, every radar known to man at the time, looking at the object we had on the pole, and we could record the returns, the pattern or the signature. We'd get the reflections off of that object, and we could rotate it, we could tilt it, and that's what we were doing to develop stealth.
Even for those cleared to work on the A-12 project, access to the radar facilities at Area 51 is strictly on a need-to-know basis.
People were not allowed in my building because we were doing things there that they had no need to know.
I didn't have the level of clearance that the people needed to be able to deal with signatures. That was the highest level of security. And they didn't ask me about the thermal part of it, even though they needed to know an answer. I didn't have a need to know that they existed. That's how compartmented things were.
It was a culture, and we thought nothing of it. You just didn't ask.
To support the CIA's top-secret Oxcart project, the development of its A-12 spy plane, Area 51 needs some major changes.
The CIA decided to invest a great deal of money to build up the base. That included adding a brand new runway, 8,500 feet long, made of concrete, with a 6,000-foot extension onto the lake bed.
In addition, 3 new hangars are built on the north side of the base. These are designated Hangar 4, 5, and 6.
The A-12, Project Oxcart, turned Area 51, which was essentially a temporary facility, into a permanent one.
By February 1962, Area 51 is now equipped to deal with a working prototype of the A-12. But first, the secret plane has to get there. The aircraft can't fly until it's been tested at Area 51. So Lockheed and the CIA have to figure out how to move it over 300 miles from the factory in Burbank, California, to Area 51 in Nevada. And they have to keep it a secret.
They put it in what they call a box, 105 feet long and 35 feet wide. And they had the aircraft inside of it.
Area 51 security guard Tom Stanks joins the convoy of California Highway Patrol and CIA operatives who accompany the aircraft, as these remarkable photographs show, widening the road, cutting down trees, and removing signposts so the enormous truck can pass.
We always parked in an area that was remote on the sides of the roads. The times that we stopped overnight is when the questions would be asked. I know one time we had 2 children on the bikes, and they said, "What do you got in that thing?" I said, "Flying saucer." They said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah, that's right, flying saucer." And "I don't believe you." I said, "Well, maybe it's not."
In total, 18 convoys are needed to deliver the CIA's A-12s to the test site. Tom Stanks is no longer cleared for access to Area 51. So today, this is as far as he can take us.
Well, here we are. We made it 3 days from Burbank, California to here. This is where the Nevada test site is, and not too far down the road is where the Nevada Highway Patrol leaves us. The Mercury Patrol catches us, and they take us to the Area 51 test site.
60 years ago, 57 miles down this road, the CIA's top secret aircraft arrives at Area 51. And so begins a new chapter in the development of stealth. By early 1960, America is playing technological catch-up with its archenemy, the Soviet Union. Intelligence gathering is the new battleground of the Cold War. And over 50 years later, documents now reveal that the Central Intelligence Agency at Area 51 goes to extreme lengths to keep its A-12 airplane project, codenamed Oxcart, under wraps. In 1962, Las Vegas resident Tom Stanks works as a security guard at the test site. His job, to make sure that only those with the right credentials get access to the base.
They had the planes coming in the morning and leaving in the afternoon. And just like any airport or airline, everyone had a badge.
They took the badge away from you, so it couldn't be tampered with. And when you came back the next day, they would match the badge to your face. I remember guards being very fussy about taking it away from you before you left, giving it back to you, comparing it every time.
Jules Cabot is just 22 when he is recruited to work at Area 51. Like everyone employed to work on special projects at the base, he needs to be cleared for access, a process that takes months to complete.
Because they didn't have much in the way of computers back then, they had to do it the old-fashioned way with legwork. So I remember neighbors, friends saying they were visited by the FBI or some other agency to see whether or not I was a foreign agent.
The need for this intense security is driven by one factor: Declassified documents released by the CIA show that in the early 1960s, Area 51 is focused on getting its A-12 stealth plane project, codenamed Oxcart, out of development and into operation. A project so sensitive that even the aircraft have code names.
We didn't call the planes planes. We called them articles. That was the terminology that we used for them. Each had a different article number. The first one was Article 121. You had Article 127, 131, different article numbers.
At every level, the A-12 program is protected by acronyms and misinformation. Even the identity of the A-12 pilots.
They had pseudo names entirely. They did not use their real names. The CIA got the names off the gravestones in Europe and assigned them to the pilots.
But Oxcart's need-to-know security means even the drivers, as the pilots are called, are not cleared to know everything.
The pilot did not even know what his mission was. All he knew is at a certain point along this flight, he just flip this switch, make this turn to this angle, go so long, turn here, come home, and not say anything about it.
These precautions are necessary. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union has leapfrogged the U.S. in the Cold War battle for military espionage. In 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, becoming the first nation on Earth to put a man-made object in space.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner.
The world's first artificial satellite is an aluminum sphere about the size of a beach ball. Inside, a battery pack and basic radio sends out a repeating pulse. But although it doesn't actually do very much, it catches the world's attention and America off guard.
When Sputnik launched, we heard that little satellite going over, beep, 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 beep. We realized we've got a problem. They're ahead of us. We didn't know how far ahead.
In the years that follow, the Soviets launch more and more sophisticated satellites, many of them flying over the United States, and worryingly for those on the Oxcart program, photographing Area 51.
We had the A-12 prototype on the boat for 18 months. But every time a satellite would come over, we knew that morning what time it would be coming over the horizon. Our intelligence was that good. And we would have to take it off the pole and run it into a building until the satellite passed.
But even these precautions have their limitations.
Ironically, we learned many, many years later that they had gotten the shape of the A-12 for the shadow because the ground was cooler underneath it. And we'd moved the plane, it was gone, but they could tell that it had been sitting there because of the difference in the heat.
By the late 1960s, Soviet satellites aren't the only things adding new impetus to technology development at Area 51. The Vietnam War is in full swing. And for American fighters, the Soviet-built MiG aircraft is proving to be a real handful.
We knew the Russians had come up with something that was great. It's whacking us. It's knocking our pilots out of the sky. We thought it was a super plane.
Now, the CIA dossier published in August 2013 lifts the lid on an Area 51 project that's been hidden from the public for the last 50 years. Declassified CIA documents contain a previously censored history of why and how Area 51 grew out of the Nevada desert and reveal an evolving picture of the nature of the work carried out there.
Area 51 is not really an air base. It's a laboratory. It's a technological laboratory. It's where we were exploiting enemy technology and analyzing the capability of the Soviet Union.
In 1968, this laboratory becomes America's base of operations for a major new initiative to test and evaluate its enemy's jet fighters. A program that grows out of U.S. losses in the early years of the Vietnam War. For every Russian-built MiG-21 American pilots shoot down in the conflict, 9 U.S.-built F-4 fighters are being destroyed. In 1968, the U.S. acquires a MiG-21 that has been flown to Israel by an Iraqi defector. The CIA secretly ships it to Area 51 for evaluation testing under the codename Have Donut.
First time I saw this baby was in 1968, one just like this, Groom Lake, Area 51. We pretty well tore it down and looked at everything. The radios, the hydraulics, the engines, everything about this plane, we examined it.
The results of the MiG-21 evaluation at Area 51 are clear. It isn't the aircraft that's the problem.
We realized it wasn't necessarily the planes, it was our people did not know how to fight. Simple as that.
Now, Area 51 becomes the birthplace of a new top-secret initiative, training American fighter pilots how to defeat Soviet MiGs in a dogfight.
We realized it took 10 missions in the war zone for a pilot to become experienced enough that he might survive the war. So we decided, with what we learned at Area 51, let's give these pilots those 10 missions in Nevada before we send them to the war zone.
To support this new program, Area 51 undergoes a new construction phase. For the third time in its short life, more facilities are added. 5 more hangars are constructed at the south end of the test site. And to prevent any sightings of the top-secret U.S.-flown MiGs out at Groom, the airspace directly above the range is closed permanently. But despite extensive measures to ensure the secrecy of the MiG training and combat operations at Area 51, its cover is almost blown in 1974, when Skylab astronauts unwittingly photographed the base from space. The Skylab incident marks a watershed moment in the life of Area 51. By the mid-1970s, the agency's U-2 and A-12 projects are winding down at the test site. Advances in satellite technology make high-flying spy planes redundant. Now the U.S. Air Force takes control of the base.
That was a huge moment in the history of Area 51. We're transitioning from use by the intelligence community to the Department of Defense, ushering in one of the most significant advancements in military technology, the stealth revolution.
When the U.S. Air Force takes control of Area 51 in 1978, it's in the middle of the most highly classified project ever to have been through the test site.
The most exciting plane that I worked on at Area 51 was the Have Blue. The prototypes, when they brought that thing in, it looked like something we'd never seen before in our lives.
The flat-faceted fuselage of the Have Blue is a revolutionary design. And it needs to be. The experimental jet is designed with one goal in mind: stealth. Unlike the A-12, which can be seen on radar, but compensates by flying in the stratosphere at supersonic speeds, the Have Blue, a subsonic jet, is designed to be virtually invisible to radar.
When it took its radar tests, the people that were inside that weren't cleared were looking at the radar and said, well, your model must have fallen off that pole out there because there's nothing up there anymore.
Not bad for an aircraft 38 feet long and with a wingspan of 22. This success sees the U.S. Air Force green-light production of an operational aircraft, designated the F-117. But creating the world's first aircraft virtually invisible to radar has an impact on those who work at Area 51. Some employees claim the disposal of anti-radar coatings used on the jet harms their health, an allegation that forces the President of the United States to take action. Area 51. Since its creation in 1955, the exotic nature of the CIA aircraft tested here break aviation records, flying higher and faster than any aircraft before. During the Cold War, these clandestine jets, flying from the secretive base, fuel a raft of UFO sightings, firing the imagination of Americans already steeped in 50s UFO culture.
The recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
But denials that Area 51 is at the heart of a UFO conspiracy fuels speculation. And in the 1980s, it reaches fever pitch with the extraordinary claims of this man.
Hi, I'm Bob Lazar. During late 1988 and early 89, I worked on the propulsion systems of extraterrestrial vehicles for the United States government.
Lazar's claims about Area 51 makes the base one of the most talked about locations in the world. But the unwanted attention can't come at a worse time for the U.S. Air Force. Area 51 is right at the heart of its most highly classified project yet: stealth.
The level of secrecy surrounding stealth is considered to be comparable to or exceeding that of the Manhattan Project development of the atomic bomb. Stealth was absolutely vital to the future of military technology.
The creation of what becomes the F-117 stealth bomber takes Area 51 into a new era of stealth technology. In particular, the development of radar-absorbing materials, or RAM.
The concept of RAM is not classified, but its composition was one of the hottest secrets at all of the era. To this day, the Defense Department considers RAM to be top secret.
Radar-absorbing material, as the name suggests, is a class of materials used to disguise a vehicle or structure from radar. Experts surmise that the F-117's RAM is made up of sheets about the thickness of linoleum and a paint containing tiny spheres coated with iron ferrite, which vibrate when hit by radar waves. The exact makeup of this radar-absorbent material is still top secret, but according to this man, RAM is the reason he's dying.
Well, these pills here are vitamin D3 pills, which are supposed to be very good for stimulating cell growth in the lungs and things like that. The doctors told me that I might live to be 64. That means I only have a year left.
Fred Dunham, a former Area 51 security guard, suffers from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a condition he says he developed overseeing the disposal of barrels of RAM in burn pits at Area 51 in the 1980s.
The drums contained carbon fiber, resin, and sealants for making the wings and different parts of the aircraft that were very hazardous when they were burned.
No satellite images of Area 51 that show these burn pits are known to exist. But according to Dunham's description, it is possible to plot them onto a map of the base.
They were just west of the Southgate control point. There was at least 6, maybe 7 burn pits that were right within 300 yards of the base population.
According to Dunham, each burn lasts 24 hours and happens twice a week for a 3-year period through the mid-80s, exposing him to clouds of toxic fumes.
It was like someone had burned a bunch of rubber tires. The soot that was in the air was unbelievable.
Dunham believes his breathing problems come from the soot and the fumes.
I'm a non-smoker, and the doctor told me that my lungs look like the lungs of an 80-year-old man who had smoked 4 packs of cigarettes every day.
In the 90s, the former security guard, along with others, brings a case against the state for medical compensation. But the case is rejected when President Clinton signs a determination which excludes Groom Lake from any investigation on the grounds of national security. For nearly 60 years, the true story of Area 51 was hidden from the public. But the release of CIA documents in 2013 helps change that.
These documents from various government agencies, finally declassified, confirm the existence of Area 51 as an official entity, and we can at last begin to unravel its secrets.
Those documents, along with satellite imagery, are now helping to map how top-secret programs at Area 51 have changed the base, a place we now know continuously evolves in line with national priorities, and with each program that comes along.
If you look at the aerial and satellite photographs taken over the years, you can see the changes. New runways, new hangars, more infrastructure. It's constantly growing and changing and building. This is not a static facility. It's extremely dynamic.
As Area 51 has changed, so too has its role.
Area 51 is not really in the common sense of that air base. Area 51 is the proving ground. That's where we can say it works or it doesn't work. You know, a lot of the missions will not touch down there. They will just fly over the base, and we can evaluate what they have come up with. It's a proof of concept facility. It's where we prove this will work or this will not work.
Created in the 50s to test the U-2, the CIA's secret base has given the U.S. the edge over its enemies for more than half a century.
Area 51 is the place where we have developed all of our stealth technologies, from the early advances of the A-12 through the modern era. Every U.S. stealth aircraft has been tested at Area 51 in one way or another.
These programs include the B-2, Advanced Cruise Missile Systems, the Air Force's latest operational strike aircraft, the Raptor, and drones now commonplace in combat zones across the world. The Raptor, unlike the F-117, is still an operational aircraft. But it, like all of the U.S. Air Force stealth programs carried out at Groom Lake in the 1980s and 1990s, remains highly classified.
Today we know about the programs like the U-2, Oxcart, the Stealth Fighter, and other demonstrators that have come since then, Tacit Blue, the Bird of Prey. But there are so many other projects, both manned and unmanned, that we may not hear about for decades.
Area 51 is light years ahead. There's no one even coming close to the technology we have developed out there. And it will continue, but that's the only way that we can remain free, safe, and be superior, is Area 51.
It's clear that the CIA story of Area 51 has played a key role in keeping America safe from its enemies. Beginning with the U-2 and A-12 projects, America's secret base saved lives in Vietnam.
The Have-Donut program completely turned around the kill ratio in Vietnam. From 9 to 1 against us, we'd lost over 8,000 helicopters alone, knocked down by the MiGs. And we completely turned that around to the point today we hadn't lost a plane to air-to-air combat in several wars, not years, but wars.
And it's a trend that continues with the F-117, an aircraft that fought successfully in not one, but 2 wars in Iraq, with no losses.
When you start off with an experimental program, you have to cross your fingers that everybody knows what they're doing and that it's going to work out right. And of course, we were amazed that it could do so well with bullets flying through the air and missiles and everything coming up. And we were all wondering, oh my God, how can anything survive all that stuff in the air?
Now, nearly 60 years after its creation, Area 51